Mohawk, Cayuga, Oneida, Onondaga, Seneca, Tuscarora. 6 nations bound together under the great tree of peace as the Iroquois League. A grand confederacy of power and strength, ruling supreme for centuries. And then along came Joseph Brant. His people charge him with shattering the Confederacy, a fracturing that echoes still today, haunting the memory and legacy of Joseph Brant. Born into one world but embracing another, he dedicated himself to be master of both. In reconciling these two worlds, he made choices. Most significantly, his allegiance to the British Crown during the American Revolutionary War, a choice for which his people paid a terrible price. Joseph Brant was born in the Ohio wilderness while his parents were on a hunting trip. But his home was the Mohawk River Valley of present-day New York State. Under this New York sky lay the principal settlement of the Mohawk Valley, Ganajahale, the original Mohawk village. It is gone now, part of the price paid for supporting the losing side. Standing on this spot, no one would know this is where Joseph Brant's house once stood. No one, except those making a pilgrimage of discovery.
Can you imagine what it was like here before, the villages? Because it's so hard to think, there was villages all over there. Those roads weren't here, these big farmhouses weren't here before. There was just villages and probably kids playing lacrosse. It'd just be so different. It's just amazing to think that was there one time.
Theda, Jesse, and Dakota Brant are descended from Joseph Brant on their father's side. They were raised on the Six Nations Reserve at Grand River in Ontario, but knew little of their famous ancestor.
All the way down the 90. Oh,
there's Mohawk. It says Mohawk right there. It might be there.
There it is right here. See it, Coda?
No.
See Ganajahale twins? Or no? Oh, there it is. Right there. See it, Jess?
What? Ganajahale?
Yep.
All that remains today of Ganajahale is the Indian Castle Church, built by Joseph Brant in 1769.
This must have been the center of this little community, Mohawk village here, because the church is right here. And I imagine all those flat lands along there would have all been the farms of the people.
Is this a reserve right now? Is there one here?
No, it's just normal state land.
Terry Lynn Brant teaches elementary school on the reserve at Grand River and now leads her daughters on this journey to their lost ancestral homeland.
We're still here hunting, and we'll always hunt. Our people are buried here, even though we can't remember them, their names, but it's still our homeland still. And I think when you come back to a place like this, you know that this is where you come from. Alita Green. That's an Indian name from the reserve too, Green. That's funny, eh? All the names that are at home are here.
Age 86 years.
Our immediate ancestors are just as important to us, and they're there and they're protected in Grand River territory, but this is our home. It's where we came from.
In the longhouses of his Mohawk heritage, Joseph's birth was of little consequence. This was a matrilineal society, much attached to hereditary honors. Honors Joseph's parents could neither claim for themselves or pass on to their children. But his mother remarried a leading civil chief, one of the Mohawk elite, a man of wealth and power. And the future immediately brightened for both Joseph and his sister Molly. The future brightened even more as Molly blossomed into a woman.
I knew full well that I had attracted William Johnson's attention. He was a successful trader as well as manager of Indian affairs for the British. In that capacity, he would come to meet with my stepfather. And of course, being a man of British authority was in high favor with my stepfather, and would of course be invited to stay at our house.
Their mutually beneficial union wasn't recognized in English law. But that didn't stop Molly from becoming a power broker in her own right, employing Johnson's wealth and position to benefit her people. And so began Joseph Brant's upward mobility, riding Molly's coattails into stately Johnson Hall.
I never knew such a world as this existed, and I wanted to embrace all that it had to offer. But I came from the longhouse of my people, and so was determined to make my mark in both worlds, and make up for the injustice of my low birth.
His parents had given him a traditional name, Dayandanega, 2 sticks bound together. A name strikingly symbolic of the course his life was to take. And so, as Joseph grew up in Johnson Hall, he grew fond of fine living, and power and splendor cast their spell over him. His lifelong attachment to the crown sealed by the thunder of gunfire. He eagerly joined a force under Johnson in repelling a French advance on British territory during this 7 Years' War. He was only 13.
I was seized with such a tremor when the firing began. I had to take hold of a small sapling to steady myself. But after a few volleys, I recovered use of my limbs and composure of mind, and took on the character of a warrior. After all my many experiences, I must admit, I like the drum and trumpet best, for they make my heart beat quick.
A warrior, yes. But Sir William had plans for Joseph and set him on the course that would mark his life forever.
I was 18 when I arrived at the Indian Charity School in Connecticut. It was strict, but I came to like this world of learning and cakes and prayers. I was taught to fear God and honor the king.
He was to put his few years of formal education to great advantage, learning to speak, read, and write English well enough to become an interpreter for the British Indian Department, a respectable and well-paying position. Brant returned to Johnson Hall to witness the great councils held on the grounds. 6 Nations leaders pressed Johnson, protesting white encroachments on their cornfields and hunting grounds. In response, Johnson initiated the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1768, establishing a boundary line at the Ohio River in an attempt to halt Western expansion. But Brant would not be restricted by boundaries, driven by a burning desire to overcome his low birth and secure a place of prominence among his people. As a fatal illness overtook Johnson, his final words to Brant were, "Joseph, control your people and thus the torch was passed.
We could all see the smoldering spirit of protest heating up in the American colonies. And if war was to be imminent, I was to ensure our rights would be protected should we once again fight for the king. The Six Nations Confederacy designated me their spokesman to directly bring before the Crown our concerns about white encroachments on our lands.
At St. James Palace, Brant is formally presented to King George III. The custom was to kiss the king's hand, but to make the point he comes not as a subject but an equal. Brant declines, offering his respects instead to Queen Charlotte. With the niceties of formal presentation over, he got down to business with the Colonial Secretary, Lord George Germain.
The Mohawks, on all occasions, have shown their zeal and loyalty to the great king. Yet, they have been very badly treated by his people. We have been often assured by our late great friend, Sir William Johnson, who never deceived us, that the king and wise men here would do us justice. It is hard, when we have already let the king's subjects have so much of our land. They should want to cheat us of the small spots we have left for our women and children.
I am well acquainted with your loyal behavior, and ask you to return to your people my most hearty thanks. Respecting the lands wrongfully taken, I know of the circumstances, but on account of the present disputes with the rebels, cannot now attend to them. But rest assured, as soon as the troubles are over, every grievance and complaint should be redressed. I hope the Six Nations will continue to fulfill their engagements with the government, as they have ever done.
To Brant, it was an ironclad promise.
Every man of us thinks that by fighting for the king, we should ensure to ourselves and children a good inheritance.
The dread the people of New England have of a war with the savages proves the expediency of our holding that scourge over them.
Joseph arrived from England in time to hear the 13 colonies formally declare their independence. With British encouragement, he traveled the Six Nations, delivering the king's promises of security in return for their fidelity. He met with resistance here and half-hearted promises there and outright hostility. Who is this upstart Joseph Brant? He was getting too white for them. Offended and resentful, Joseph determined to at least save our Mohawks.
For the Six Nations, this war of Britisher against Britisher was difficult to comprehend. It was a family affair. They had seen it all before. European powers engaged in conflict for control of the continent. And the Six Nations had handled it well, reaping material benefits by playing one side off against the other, all the while maintaining the guise of neutrality. But Joseph Brant understood the American Revolutionary War was different. The American colonists fully intended to take every inch of land. He challenged the principle and tradition of neutrality.
It was a naive view. We had to pick a side, and my natural affinity was with the British. This time, we would not be the pawns of European powers, caught in the middle, but would use the war for our own purposes, securing our lands and freedoms.
The war brought together both worlds of Joseph Brant. He is a captain in the British Army and principal war chief of the Six Nations. The war now forced the Six Nations to take a stand.
By tradition, each nation was free to act as it wished. We met in our longhouse at Onondaga, but could not reach a unanimous decision. Mohawk, Cayuga, and Seneca sided with the Loyalist cause. The Oneida and Tuscarora honored existing ties to the Germans and Dutch. The Onondaga were split down the middle.
Fort Stanwix was the last American outpost on the frontier, standing in defense of their western settlements. A force of British regulars and their Six Nations allies laid siege to the fort.
I persisted in Ganajohole, amidst the good farmers and tradesmen of Trujillo County. My brother was with the British expedition laying siege to Stanwix. I knew General Herkimer was rousing a formidable militia force from this area, including Oneidas, to march in relief. I sent that information on to Joseph.
I think this is the place, too, where Molly had written to Joseph.
With Molly's warning, the supremely confident British planned an attack of the American militia approaching Stanwix at nearby Oriskany.
Here, the Battle of Oriskany was fought. 6th day of August, 1777. Fight until the enemy fled. The lifeblood of more than 200 patriot heroes made this battleground sacred forever. Well, if they lost 200 Americans, I wonder how many Indians were left. I know there was a whole bunch of chiefs. Oneida's chiefs lost many. It's too bad they didn't mention them. Herkimer had with him, I think he said 50 or 60 Oneidas, which is the sad part for us. Because they always said it was Joseph Brant who broke up the Confederacy, but I don't know. Herkimer already had the Oneidas fighting with him at that time, and there were Mohawks and Senecas, a lot of them on the other side. That was significant. That's what's the significant thing here, that the Confederacy itself was fighting against each other. And that's what they said, the great peace was broken. This is the place. And maybe that's why the Indian people lost so many. Because the first time in the history since we were given the Great Law, that since we were given that, our people took up arms against each other. And maybe that's, I can see the Oneida's point, this was their homelands and they wanted to retain it. But when the Confederacy people fought, that was a sad day for us. Hopefully it'll never happen again.
The still vacillating Seneca had been invited to come along to Oriskany to watch the British soundly defeat the Americans and Oneida. But it was the Indian allies on both sides who bore the brunt of the battle.
Any remaining hesitation vanished. We were now steadfastly in the war. No longer would we simply serve as auxiliaries to the British force, but now took the offensive. We launched raids, made the war our own, and made it our way. Hey, ready. This was our homeland.
An attack on settlements in the Wyoming Valley is in retaliation for Indian losses at Oriskany. Brant was not there, but the attack is blamed on him. The Americans call him the Monster Brant. The horror of warfare continues. Over 200 civilians are killed or taken prisoner at Cherry Valley, slaughtered, scalped by a force of Rangers under Lieutenant Colonel Walter Butler. Brant was there, but the historical record vindicates him, protecting women and children by putting his mark upon them. America was finally and firmly aroused.
The cries of the distressed, of the fatherless, and the widows come to me from all quarters.
George Washington was commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, and under enormous pressure to break the power of the Indians to make war. But he was also a land speculator, and had his eye on Western expansion for both nationalistic and personal benefit.
The object of the expedition shall be to lay waste all the Indian settlements, not merely to overrun them, but to destroy them.
The Sullivan Campaign is one of the largest offenses of the entire war. A pincer-like assault on Six Nations homelands by 4 brigades, totaling 4,500 men.
Private load. Ready.
Washington's army succeeded in making us refugees in our own land, systematically wiping out our villages along the Mohawk River.
Fire!
When Washington's army entered the country of Six Nations, we called him Town Destroyer. And to this day, when that name is heard, women look behind them and turn pale. Our children cling close to our necks.
My sister Molly was driven from the Mohawk Valley by the Oneida in retaliation for her role in their Oriskany losses. She fled to Fort Niagara.
Fort Niagara was the wretched repository of a devastated people. Now homeless, their Confederacy broken, they desperately need a Moses. But do not anoint Brant as such, and wait for Britain to win the war.
Joseph carried on. He married into Mohawk nobility. Now he had more power. And the lurking jealousies of our people began to gather steam.
With Washington's armies marching on, Britain faces the inevitable and enters into peace negotiations. No mention is made of securing any land for the Six Nations, lands they had just fought, bled, and died for.
England has sold the Indians to Congress.
The Americans view both the territory and the Indians as conquered, and move quickly to establish isolated reservations and free vast expanses of productive land, especially the fertile lands of the prized Mohawk Valley.
The peace treaty does not legally deprive us of our lands.
A great council of nations is held at Sandusky, a Seneca settlement. Brant set about the first wish of his heart: unity of all the nations.
You Wyandot, Delaware, Shawnee, Mingo, Odawa, Chippewa, Potawatomi, Creek, and Cherokee. Our interests are alike. We, the Six Nations, with this belt, bind your hearts and minds with ours, that there may be never a separation between us. Never should anything be done but by the voice of the whole, as we make but one with you. We will make no peace treaty until our lands are secured.
In union was strength. and all agreed to this general confederacy. Brant saw to it the Six Nations Longhouse would be at its head, and at the head of the Longhouse, Joseph Brant.
This country belongs to the United States. Their blood hath defended it and will forever protect it.
Brant's alliance of nations is ignored by Congress. The Stanwig's boundary is violated, America gaining vast territories through piecemeal treaties. Tribal factionalism among the nations is destroying Brant's agenda. His future now lay with the British in Canada. Sir Frederick Holden is the Commander-in-Chief of Quebec and His Majesty's forces.
We, the Mohawks, were the first Indians that took you by the hand as friends and brothers, and invited you to live amongst us. As you increased, we remained your friends, joining you against your enemies, sacrificing numbers of our people. For you, we have often so freely bled. You promised to defend us and our country against all encroachments. You have records which will confirm the truth of these words. Wherefore, brother, I am now sent on behalf of all the King's Indian allies to receive a decisive answer from you, and to know whether they are included in this treaty or not.
Holden proposed land at the eastern head of Lake Ontario, the Bay of Quinte area, but Brant wanted a settlement more to the west, the Grand River area.
I had my reasons for expressing a preference for the Grand River region. First, the land there was much similar to our lost and beloved Mohawk Valley. Second, a powerful and integrated community on the Grand would be as a bridge to the Western nations. Third, I did not wish to isolate the Senecas, still clinging to part of their land in western New York, vulnerable on the borders of American settlement.
I have, at the earnest desire of many of these, His Majesty's faithful allies, purchased a tract of land from the Indians, situated between the lakes Ontario, Erie, and Huron. And I do hereby, in His Majesty's name, authorize and permit the said Mohawk Nation, and such other of the Six Nations Indians as wish to settle in that quarter, to take possession of and settle upon the banks of the river commonly called Ooze or Grand River, running into Lake Erie, allotting to them for that purpose 6 miles deep from either beside of the river beginning at Lake Erie and extending in that proportion to the head of the said river, which them and their posterity are to enjoy forever.
During the winter and spring of 1784-85, 1,600 people, the majority of them Mohawk, moved from their Fort Niagara refuge to their new home. Brant is Moses after all. He locates an area of the river shallow enough to cross, thus creating Brant's Ford, now the Ontario city of Brantford. They now have land, but nothing else, and are in a greatly diminished state, impoverished. Brant sailed again for London to make representations of compensation for the Six Nations. Apprehensive about the future, he pressed for a commitment of military aid in the event of a continuing confrontation with the Americans.
The American states have surveyed and laid out a great part of the lands on our side of the boundary line fixed at Fort Stanwix. We earnestly beg of you to reflect seriously upon our critical situation. It was from an attachment to your interests that we made enemies of the Americans, and we are still involved in hostilities, whilst you are enjoying the blessings of peace, of which we, your allies, have not hitherto felt the good effects.
It was a controversial request, and he settled in for a long stay. Brant and Hugh Percy, the Duke of Northumberland, struck up a long-lasting friendship during Percy's military service in America. Brant often enjoyed the sumptuous hospitality of the Duke's London home, Scion House. The war had been long, 6 years, and had cost Brant a lot personally, investing much of his own money and resources to sustain his force of loyalist volunteers, and his traveling of the nation seeking unity. He secures generous compensation for both Molly and himself, and, as a former captain, continuing half pay for life. Brant returned to the new settlement that has taken hold on the Grand River. He is well settled in a home and lifestyle modeled on the Johnson Hall home of his youth, but can't let go of the belief he can still influence events south of the border.
Britain wouldn't commit to providing military aid, needing and wanting trade with America. In every direction, settlers were encroaching on our lands. The Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, Georgia, the Carolinas. An undeclared war was raging along the frontier, but this time, the settlers would not be driven away. Joseph traveled the Western nations, proposing compromise, still trying to preserve his vision of unity. He knew far more than they how to deal with the Americans, but they resented his interference. At councils, when the war hatchet was passed around, he would not take it. But most of all, he felt guilty. The Oneidas, America's allies, still had their homeland, while the rest of the Six Nations faced the disastrous consequences of a war he did his best to involve them in.
George Washington was now president. Needing to establish peace along the frontier, he tried to co-opt Brant, instructing his Secretary of War to offer Brant bribes.
1,000 guineas. And double my British half-pay and pension. Merely on condition that I try to bring about a peace with the Western Indians. After refusing that, I was offered the right to land in the amount of 20,000 pounds U.S. currency and an annuity of $1,500.
Determined to be nobody's pawn, Brant turned from political high idealism to practical concerns and focused on the Grand River lands. From the outset, he regards the territory as his own to manage, and believing he can still retain control over the lands, sets himself up as landlord. He will sell and lease portions of the lands. The Six Nations will then live off the returns. London reacted. The Crown owns the lands. It has been given to the Indians in trust for their exclusive use only.
The Ministry intends to forbid the Indians any other use of the lands than that of sitting down upon them. They might think that because I have half pay, I should not talk so much. But am I for this entirely to forsake the interests of my people, who put their dependence on me? We want to hold this land, just as we held our land in the Mohawk Valley. To sell what we don't need, to keep enough for all the nations to settle here if they wish. Anything less will be fatal for my people. What I now most lament is that my sincere attachment to the king has ruined the interests of my nation. This interfering with our lands makes me much desirous of having some tract of land within the United States.
Brant's hands were untied. He was given power of attorney by the Six Nations to surrender the blocks of land to the Crown, which in turn reconveyed them to Brant's original purchasers. There had been rumors about the sources of Brant's personal wealth, and with these land transactions, the rumors were now out in the open. The ill feelings were further aggravated by his practice of giving land to friends from the British Indian Department and loyalists he had fought with. He wanted to settle whites among his people, to provide them models for the way of life he wished them to adopt. The Holden tract of almost 1 million acres has been reduced to a reserve now consisting of less than 5% of the original holding. The Grand River Six Nations have initiated a court challenge, seeking an accounting of how these lands were disposed of, and what became of the proceeds, which were to have been invested for their benefit by the government of the day.
We wanted people on these lands, large blocks of land, that the people would stay on there and that they would pay us yearly rentals on a mortgage. And that money we would use for our health, our education, all of our needs that would be required.
Phil Montour is a Six Nations lawyer leading the court challenge.
Our money was misused. It was transferred into where we have no benefits today. We know our money built roads and bridges throughout Ontario. Yeah, actually in other provinces as well. The railways opened up the country. Our money went into railways. It's continuous.
Today, the Grand River Six Nations are settled 15 minutes outside of Brantford. Indian Reserve number 40, centered by the village of Ishwegan.
It's still a really big reserve. It's the most populated, and we could have had nothing. We could have been like a northern community. It's like some reserves started out with nothing. They just all moved there, and that was it. But Joseph Brant had, like, smart enough to like trade and know what his people would need, and like you can tell now, like how well off we are, how well off Six Nations is compared to other reserves that are around. And we survived. We're a really strong nation, and you can see that.
Theda Brant's defense of her famous ancestor remains for the most part the minority view among her people.
He was very successful in negotiating us this tract of land. Very successful. You can't take that away from him. But the other thing is, did he get a bad rap? Certainly he did. Until we find out really what happened to our land and money, he will always have that bad rap.
Norman Jacobs is an elder on the reserve.
Some of our people were sitting there waiting. They were saying, well, that the interest money from the land sales and the leases is coming. And it didn't come. So there was people that, I understand there was people that starved to death, children, because of it.
Brant's formal commission as a captain, along with his status as a loyalist, entitled him to a personal land grant. The head of Lake Ontario, Burlington Bay, was his choice. By 1803, he has built a new house there. It is a mansion. Feeling suspicions, he is pocketing money off the top of whatever annuities do show up in Grand River. But if he has a secret cache of money, none of it shows up in the will he was to later write. He lives like a country gentleman on a block of land known as Wellington Square, but continues administering the affairs of Grand River.
Even Joseph had to admit that he had been a constant irritant. He built a school and berated those who would not send their children. He admonished warriors for hunting instead of farming. He urged Christianity and church attendance. He wanted his people to follow the example that he had set, but they resented his low birth and high pretensions. Ambition and desire of wealth were his ruling passions. Conspiracies against him were no secret. Joseph's own son, Isaac, drunkenly attacked him and died accidentally from a blow Joseph struck in order to ward off the attack. In our family, we all understood it, even Joseph. For if he was marked for assassination, better the deed be done by his own family to preserve peace. For the Indian custom was to extract revenge upon revenge for a killing in an endless cycle. Joseph became watchful, felt vulnerable, and started drinking openly. He still believed that his people were helpless without him, but decided that he could no longer live with them. Life in Burlington was very much one of self-imposed exile. He spent more and more time at Burlington Bay with fewer and fewer visitors. In the fall of 1807, he fell ill.
What is to befall us, the people of the Longhouse?
Joseph Brant died November 24th, 1807 at Burlington Bay, and there lay buried for 43 years. In 1850, the Grand River Six Nations reclaimed Joseph Brant. Relays of young Mohawks were sent cross-country, and on the shoulders of these pallbearers, grandsons of the men he had fought beside, the remains of Joseph Brant were carried back home. He was relayed to rest beside the chapel in Brantford, given the Mohawks by the British Crown in recognition of their loyalty during the Revolutionary War. In non-native society, Joseph Brant is given his due as a loyal defender of the Crown. The monument, dedicated in 1886, still stands today in the center of Brantford. His figure, 9 feet tall, cast in bronze melted down from British cannons used in the Battle of Waterloo, stands imperiously on a granite pedestal high above surrounding figures representing the Six Nations. To many of his people, Joseph Brant was too great a man, and he was an extraordinary character of history. But the questions linger, incarcerating him as surely does his tomb.